Hello everyone, welcome to another segment of Intellectual Brainstorming and Academic Excellence. My name is David Oni and my YouTube channel is David Oni. I want to use this medium to say a very big thank you to our returning subscribers and also to encourage those that have not subscribed to our channels to do so. As you all know, this channel is all about intellectual brainstorming. It's all about academic excellence. It's the brain behind it is to assist our teaming, Nigerian students in achieving academic excellence. Today, we're going to look at something different, something wonderful, something creative, something dynamic, something interesting, like we always do. My name once again is David Oni, and my YouTube channel is David Oni Wiz. As you know, the Wiz there is WIZ. So, I want to use this medium to say, to encourage you to leave your comment on our channel, also to subscribe to our channel. Apart from subscribing, don't forget to click on the notification button and also to like our channel. These are very, very important. Now, today we are going to look at what we call colonial administration. Colonial administration. Colonial administration. Now, what do we mean by colonial administration? Like we said in our previous topics, when we're talking about imperialism, we're talking about colonialism, we talked about mercantilism. We discussed a lot of things about these three topics, and these topics were eye opener to us into this topic we're diving into today. So to really help our students to really know what we are talking about. So in our last topic, we discussed colonialism. And we said virtually all the continent of Africa experienced, the impact or the influence of colonial power. Now, and that the only country that was not colonized at that time was actually, the country called Liberia. Now, moving forward, as a result of the scrambling and the partitioning of Africa in 1884 and 1885, which was referred to as the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference was actually the period in which the colonial powers of Britain, Portugal, Germany, and France actually partitioned and scrambled West Africa. That was the period of the scrambling and the partitioning of West Africa. Now, at this particular period of time, most of the European powers were not willing to be engaged directly in direct occupation of their colonies. It wasn't until the year 1890, as a result of the Brussels Conference, Brussels Conference in 1890, that was when the European powers now decided to have the direct occupation of their colonies. So from the period of 1885 to the period of 1950, from the period of 1885 to the period of 1950, all the various African states were being colonized by one European power to another. And these European countries that actually colonized this area were actually the British, the French, the Germans, and also the Portuguese. Now, you will ask yourself, what actually led to the advent of colonialism? Towards the 19th century, there was actually, the demand for, slave trade at that time was already at the lowest ebb. That is, the way and the manner at which people were being transported from Africa to other foreign countries to engage them in slave trade was actually at the lowest level. Why was it like that? As a result of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution actually reshaped the history of the African continent. And because of this Industrial Revolution, there was a need for these European countries to seek for a new market outside Europe. So the demand for a new market outside Europe actually led to what we call colonialism. So Industrialization brought about development, it brought about new discovery, and as a result of that, the various European countries were engaged in what we call overproduction. And because they were engaged in what in overproduction, there was a need for them to seek for a new market where they can actually what sell their commodity. And that was the reason why most of these countries they had to migrate, they have to leave, they have to go on exploration into to seek for new colonies and to seek for new continents. And that was how the issue of colonialism actually started in Africa, in West Africa. So when you're talking about colonial rule, we're talking about the period at which the various African continents were being colonized by their various colonial masters. Now, in this topic, we're still going to look at what we call the two biggest colonial masters at that time, which was the British people, and the French people. The British people introduced what we call indirect rule, while the French introduced what we call the policy of assimilation and the policy of association. So sit back and enjoy. Now, when you talk about the colonial administration, it was actually divided into two parts. We have the central administration, and we also have what we call the native administration. The central administration and the native administration. When you talk about the central administration, you are talking about the role that was being played by the Governor General, who was superseded by what we call the Secretary of State that was located in London at that time. And the central administration was divided into the Legislative Council and the Executive Council. The Legislative Council and the Executive Council. Then the native administration was talking about the Indigenous Administration that was, in practice at that particular time in those colonies that were being colonized by the colonial masters. So the native administration is talking about the indigenous system that was being used. And at that time, what was the policy that was being used by the British government? It was called the policy of indirect rule. And what do we mean by indirect rule? We're still going to look at that in our subsequent topic. When you're talking about indirect rule, it's a colonial policy of administrating our territories without the British government interfering directly in the affairs of these colonies. Because this system, the British government were performing what we call supervisory function. They are performing what we call supervisory function. We're still going to look at that under what we call indirect rule. Now, what are the reasons for colonialism? One of the reasons is what we call economic reasons. I've discussed that before. I said the reason why the British government and the Portuguese and the French and the Germans decided to come to the African continent was to seek for a new market where they could be able to sell their overproduced products, because at that time they were producing most of these goods in high volume, and apart from that, they were also seeking for what we call raw materials at that particular time, so that they could be able to use them in their industry to facilitate productive process. The other one is what we call religious reasons or religious factor. At that particular time, the Europeans had already accepted Christianity, and they were looking for areas which they could be able to grow Christianity or to spread what we call Christianity. And that was why when they were coming to Africa, they had to inform their government in those places that they were seeking for territories, new territories where they could be able to spread the gospel of Christianity. Then another one is what we call exploration. Europeans are very explorative. They like looking for new discoveries and new ideas. So the need for exploration made them to come to the continent of Africa. Then another one is what we call civilization. At that particular time, the Europeans believed that they had the highest level of civilization, and that their civilization was more superior and more sophisticated and more modernized than those of the other colonies. And as a result of that, they felt they could actually introduce this civilization into these colonies, and that was one of the reasons. The other reason is the slavery reason. Now, when you talk about slavery reasons, You're talking about, the Europeans at that particular time were against what? They were against what we call slavery. They were against slavery. And at that time, they were looking for an opportunity to actually cut off slavery and introduce what we call what? Industrialization. To introduce what? Modernization. To introduce what? Development in most of these colonies. And that was why when the British government, they came into Nigeria, they actually introduced what we call what? Indirect policy. And that policy was meant to develop those colonies at their own basis. Now, let us now look at the features of what do we by what we call indirect rule. Let me quickly go through that topic of what we call indirect rule. Now, what do we mean by indirect rule? Now, this is the definition. Indirect rule is a British colonial policy of administering our colonies with the customs and tradition put into effect, whereby the British government were only supervising the administration. So indirect rule is a British colonial policy of administering what? Our colonies with the traditional laws, customs, and tradition being protected, and British officials merely supervising the administration. Then you ask yourself, who actually introduced the policy of indirect rule? The policy of indirect rule was actually introduced by the man called Frederick Lord Lugard. Frederick Lord Lugard. At that time, Frederick Lord Lugard regarded indirect rule as what? As a child of a necessity. As a child of what? Of a necessity. Owing to the prevailing factors at that particular time. So at that time, the British government believed that indirect rule was a child of necessity. So the indirect rule recognized what? The customs, the traditions, the beliefs, the way of life of Africans. It did not interfere with the way of life of the Africans. Rather, it gave them that privilege to still maintain their customs and their tradition. But the role that was being played by the British government at that time, was a supervisory role or function by the British government. Now, you ask yourself, at the British policy of indirect rule at that time had already succeeded in India because of the success of this policy of indirect rule. Because of that success of indirect rule in India at that time, the British government felt that they could also introduce the policy of indirect rule in Nigeria. We're still going to look at the factors that made them to actually introduce what we call the policy of indirect rule. Now, what are the characteristics of the indirect rule policy? Number one of them is that the indirect rule policy recognized the existing customs and traditions of the people. It recognized the customs and tradition of the people. Number two was that the system did not interfere directly in the affairs of the people. It did not interfere directly in the affairs of the people. Then another one is that traditional rules and regulations were actually used under the policy of indirect rule. That is the system of the traditional way of life of the people were actually used in the system of indirect rule. Then you ask yourself, under the indirect rule system, the system also recognized the role of the traditional rulers. The role of the traditional rulers, and that was why in that time they recognized the role of the Oba, in the eastern part of the country, because there were no Oba. They also used what we call the warrant chiefs. Then in the northern part of the country, where we had the emirs, they also used the emirs. They also used the emirs. So it recognized the customs and tradition of the people. Then native authorities were what? Were used. Native authorities were what? Were actually used under the indirect rule system. Another one is that taxes were actually collected under the what? Under the indirect rule system. Taxes were actually collected. Now, let me quickly look at the reasons why the indirect rule was actually introduced in Nigeria. Number one, lack of personnel. One of the factors that led to the policy of indirect rule being used in Nigeria at that time was the problem of what? Of lack of personnel. Now, what do we mean by lack of personnel? At that time, there were various diseases that were plaguing Africa at that time that did not have cure. And because of that, if most of these European people actually come to Nigeria, most of them might die of what? Of malaria and typhoid and other diseases at that time, which does not have a cure. So the fear of what? Of death. So at that time, Africa was regarded as what? As a white man's graveyard. It was regarded as a white man's graveyard. So because it was regarded as a white man's graveyard, most of them did not want to come to Africa because they don't want to die. The other factor is what? Is inadequate fund. There was not enough money to run the policy of indirect rule. And that was why the British government did not have any other option than to adopt the indirect rule policy in Nigeria because of a lack of fund. Then I also mentioned something that indirect rule was successful in India. Don't forget. Now, because the indirect rule was successful in India, that made them to also introduce the policy in Nigeria. They believed that if the policy could succeed in India, it could also succeed in where? In Nigeria. They believe that the policy could also succeed in Nigeria. Then another factor is that indirect rule was very, very cheap. It was easy to maintain. It was not expensive. It didn't take much money from the British colonial government. So it was very cheap for them to maintain an indirect rule policy than to maintain what we call the opposite of indirect rule policy. So the policy was very, very cheap. It was very easier for the British government to adopt this policy than any other policy. And that was why the policy of indirect rule was embraced by the British government as a colonial policy to be adopted in their colonies in Nigeria. Now, don't forget that the British government did not colonize Nigeria only, it colonized all the other countries, which we're still going to look at in our subsequent topic. So we're still going to look at all those topics. The another one is that the system was meant to preserve the traditions and customs of the people. The British government realized that Africans love their culture, they love their languages, they love their way of life. And when you talk about their way of life, you talk about culture. So they did not want to interfere with the existing culture and tradition of the people. So the policy of indirect rule was introduced because the British government wanted to maintain the existing culture and tradition of the people. Then another one is language difficulty. Don't forget at that time, most of these people in Africa or in Nigeria could not speak English. They were speaking their own native language. So language difficulty or barrier was a problem. Was one of the reasons why the British government had to introduce the policy of indirect rule. The other one is the largeness of the area. The area was so big. So if they had introduced what we call a direct rule policy, the system wouldn't have been able to work. Don't forget that the British policy of indirect rule was a conjunction between the British government and the traditional system. So they were using the traditional rulers to rule the people, and the British government, on the other hand, were only supervising the administration. So on this topic, we have looked at what we call colonialism. We have looked at what we call the reasons, reasons for colonialism. We mentioned what we call, economic reasons. We mentioned religious. We mentioned the exploration, slavery. We mentioned the civilization. Then we also look at what we call the indirect rule system. We said the indirect rule system is a British colonial policy of administering our colonies with the traditional rules and customs in practice, why the British government only supervise the administration. That is indirect rule. And we have said that the indirect rule policy was introduced by the man called the Chief Lord Lugard. Lord Lugard eventually became the Governor General of Nigeria at that time. And if you remember, at that particular time, that was how the issue of what we call the amalgamation of Nigeria actually took place in what we call 1914. 1914. 1914. So the period in which Nigeria, the Southern Protectorate of Nigeria and the Northern Protectorate of Nigeria were actually amalgamated together was the year 1914 by the British government. The amalgamation of Nigeria. From there, the process of Nigerian constitutional development followed from there, where we have the Clifford Constitution, we have the Richard Constitution, we have the Legislative Constitution, we have the Macpherson Constitution, we have the Independent Constitution, we have the Constitutional Conference in London, in Lagos, and the rest of them. Then we have the Independent Constitution, we have the Republican Constitution, and another constitution like that. Presently, we have what? We have the present constitution that we have now, But the Nigerian Constitution, or the constitution we're using now, is a reflection of what? Of the military constitution, not the constitution that is made by the people themselves. It was the constitution that was drafted by the military government, and that's why today people are clamoring for a change, for a restructuring, for a change of the constitution, because that constitution was not made by the Nigerian people in particular. It was the constitution that was actually imposed on them by the military juntas, and that constitution does not reflect the wishes and aspirations of the people in this particular area. Now, on that note, I am going to end the topic on the colonial administration. I'm going to continue from where I stop in the next class. Then, apart from that, I want to say a very big thank you to our subscribers, our returning subscribers. I say a very big thank you. And if you have not subscribed to our channel, please do that. Please subscribe to this channel. Apart from subscribing, don't forget to leave your comment. Leave your comment, draft a comment, write a comment, so that we can be able to serve you better. And don't forget also to click on the notification button, and also to also encourage other people that have not subscribed to this channel to also subscribe to this channel. Don't forget, my name once again is David Oni, and my YouTube channel is David Oni Wiz, W-I-Z. Till we meet next time, thank you and God bless you. Bye bye.